All right, everybody. So in this section, we are going to build out an API with Django. So we're just going to add in an API into this application, and we're going to have a new way of serving data and interacting with the data that we already have. So before we get started, just wanted to go over a few things. So for those of you that are completely new who might not even know what an API is or why we need it, I would recommend you start with this section, try to follow along. We're going to do a full introduction. But if anything confuses you and you get stuck here, I would recommend moving on to the next section. Nothing we do here is going to be dependent on what we do in the next section. So just go ahead, jump forward, and start getting ready to deploy your application. So this is a concept that not everybody is ready to fully understand. Not everybody knows why we need it. So if you're just trying to grasp the basics and deploy your application, move on. But if you're ready for this section, which a lot of people are excited about, let's go ahead and get into it. So what we're going to do here is we are going to first go over the basics of what an API is. I want to cover some topics here, and then we're going to use the Django REST framework to add in an API, and we're just going to start serving up data. Now, what I wanted to do here is not just show you how to build an API, but I also wanted to show you how to interact with that data, and not just using something like Postman. I know a lot of tutorials use Postman and they'll just show you how to interact with it. I want to actually build out a front end, which we'll just use JavaScript for this, and we're just going to make some API calls, load it into a page, and it's going to be like a separate application from what we currently have. And we're also going to add in authentication. So we're going to use JSON Web Tokens so we can actually log in using a JSON Web Token and get API data. So I wanted to show you how to actually interact with it from the front end and not just make the simple calls. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So this infographic or this picture is going to be available for everyone. It's going to be in the resources folder in the GitHub repo. So you can download it and actually study it as you need to follow along here, or just reference it later. So what the heck is an API? If you look this up, you're probably going to find some super technical definition that's going to leave you more confused than when you first started even doing your research. At least that's how I was in the beginning. So what I want to do here is I want to give you my best explanation of it, and then I want to go into why we might even need an API. And I want to give you some examples of why we would use it and how we would use it, and then it'll eventually make sense. I know a lot of people don't understand this concept, not because it's a tough one to understand, but because they don't even know why they need it. Therefore, it makes it hard to really understand something when you don't know why you're using it. So don't worry if you don't get it right away. Eventually, it will make sense. Once we start building it, things will start clicking. So this is my definition of an API. So an API is a part of our application that provides data and endpoints being URLs, for others to interact with and view data from our application. So that might not make full sense to you or might not completely make sense to you. So let me say it this way. Imagine we have a friend that builds out a website, and on their website, they want to display all the projects from our website. So the project that we have right now, they want to display all those projects that users are sharing. So one way to go about this is we could, in theory, give our friend access to our database, which would be very unsafe. What we can do is build out an API and give them that endpoint, so the URL. And once our friend accesses that endpoint, they will get all of our data for the projects in JSON format. So that's just a uniform way of interacting with data and viewing it. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So they would get that data using probably JavaScript to make that API call. They can load in that data into their application without ever needing to access our database. So we can share data. That's one thing we can do with it. We can also use an API within our own application, and we'll see some examples of this in a second. So when might we need an API? So the first one here I listed out was mobile apps. And these are my unofficial definitions because anything else online you can find. And I also really don't like how things are worded online. I feel like they're too technical, so beginners don't really understand them. So my first example would be if you wanted to build a mobile app. And why I really like this one is because a lot of people also ask me if they can build mobile apps with Django. Now the answer for this is yes and no. So you can't build an app with Django, but you can build the data for an app. You can actually provide the data to an app from Django. So let's say you used Swift or Java. There's also Flutter or React Native. You can build an app with one of those frameworks or programming languages, whatever you want to call them, whatever you're using. You can build an app using that. You can't do it with Django, but you can build up your database in Django, build out an API, and provide data to that app. So that app will need some kind of JSON formatted data, and that app can make a request to your Django application or to your API and load that in. So that's one example of when you might need it. So the second option or a second case here would be if you're using a front-end framework. So let's say you're using React. There's also Angular, there's Vue. These frameworks need data in JSON format. So what you would do is you would build your front end and you would simply use JavaScript to make those API calls, pull the data from the server and into your application. So front end frameworks, I like to use React and Django a lot together. It's actually my favorite combination. I have a full course on Udemy on using React and Django for an e-commerce website. You can check that one out, but that's one example. Now, number 3, this is sharing and providing data. That's kind of like what I mentioned right here with our friend that wanted to use our data. And some other examples might be applications that you've already seen out there. So YouTube, they have an API. If you want to access some user data or subscriber accounts, you can actually access an API that YouTube provides publicly. And all this data is going to be in JSON format. I know Twitter has it, and they basically just allow people to see data from their website or from their server without actually touching the database. So one website that actually uses the YouTube API is Social Blade. They use Twitter's and a few other platforms. So you can actually see a platform using one of these APIs. So that's an example here. So mobile apps might require one, a front-end framework if you're using data and sharing and providing data with other developers. You can also use it in your own application. So let's go ahead and talk about APIs versus REST APIs. So I wanted to address this one because people always get this one wrong. A lot of people will build out a simple API and they'll tell you, hey, I built out a REST API. So you built out an API and it's not a REST API until you follow the REST specifications. So a REST API is simply an API that follows the REST specifications or the REST conventions. So it's a simple way of building out an API that makes it RESTful. So we'll get into some examples in a second. So I just wanted to go over that one because I know some people get ticked off if you say REST API and your API is not RESTful. So I just wanted to show the difference there. And let's look at some more definitions. So API, this is usually what you would find online. This just stands for Application Programming Interface. To most people, that means nothing. That's just a technical definition, but that's what the acronym stands for. Just wanted to list that out. And REST stands for Representational State Transfer. So let's look at what a REST API might look like. So let's say our friend that wanted to access all of our projects, let's say we wanted to give them the endpoint. So the endpoint right here, or the URL, we would tell them visit website.com, so whatever our website name is, and then you don't have to add in API, but you could, that's usually convention. You would say access our website, API, and then projects. So this would give them the list of projects here. So they would get back projects formatted looking something like this right here, and I'll go down there in a second. So they would get a JSON response of all our projects depending on how we decided to format it. So this endpoint, so this is the endpoint for anything including projects. So this is what a RESTful example might look like. So in this case, if we wanted to work with this endpoint would change what it does depending on what kind of method we're sending. So the HTTP method, that's a get method, which we've seen. We've seen post method. We've worked with that a lot. There's also put, delete, and there's a whole bunch of different types of methods. So we'll go into some examples, but basically things change depending on the method we send here. So let's look at some examples here. So we have API / projects. This is going to be a get method. So what this is going to do is it's going to return back a list, or in this case, because it's JSON data, it's an array. So it's an array of objects. And in this case, we're just seeing 2 projects. We get all the data about the projects, and that's what our friend would get if they call this endpoint. Now, what if our friend called a GET request to that endpoint, but they added the ID to a project? Now they would get back a specific project because of that ID right there. They would get back this project with that ID. Now, this is where things get a little bit more RESTful. So you notice how we're not saying project and then ID. We're saying projects. So we're just still keeping that same naming convention. We're just adding the ID. So that's more RESTful. Now, a put method is typically used when we want to update a specific part of a project in this case, or an item. So put is used for updating. In this case, we're accessing the same endpoint. Look at this right here. You would think that would mess something up. We're still going to API/projects, but in this case, because it's a put method, we would send some data. So we would send a body with that, and we would say the ID that we're trying to access by the URL, and we would simply add in new data, and now our project with the ID of 1 would have the title of new title. So that's the RESTful practice. Now, if we wanted to delete something, same URL, look at that, API projects 1. And if we send a delete method, that's the HTTP method, this project is now deleted. And I have all these explanations right here. Now, if we wanted to add a project, we would go to API/project. So the same one as this one right here. So if we look here, we're going to that route, but because we're sending a post request, we have to send some data with it. So we send that data as the body or the parameters here, and we just send the title that we want to set. Typically, you wouldn't send an ID, that would get auto-generated, but we would just send this over and we would return back that project. So I didn't add a return statement because that's up to you here, but in this case, you'd probably get back the project you just created. So that's the RESTful convention. There's a lot more we can go into here. I didn't want to go into all the examples here, but that's just basically a way of formatting your API. And it makes for really good practice when you're working with somebody else. They don't have to guess how you built out your API. They can typically already figure it out. If it's already RESTful, they can see a couple of URLs and already predict exactly how to work with your application. So with that being said, let's go ahead and close this out and let's talk about the Django REST framework. So this is what we're going to be using here. So let me pull this up here. So we're going to start without the Django REST framework, but we will eventually use this. And this is basically a toolkit or a library that's built on top of Django that makes for building APIs very easy. So we're going to install it using a pip install here. I'll zoom in here. We're going to install it. We'll get things set up and we will start building out our API. So before we actually get started, I want to build out an API without the Django REST framework, and then we're going to run this install. So don't run this just yet. I want to show you how to do it without it, and then we'll also see the advantage of using this library here or this toolkit. So let's go into our application here, and my server should be on, so I have that running. And there's multiple ways of structuring this API. Some people like to go into each app, so our projects app and our users app, and they would create a folder called API just for that specific app. In my case, I'm going to create a folder out here side by side with those called API, and we're just going to handle our entire app's application in one API folder. So we're not going to separate this one. So there's multiple ways of doing it. We could run the start app command, clean up that folder, and we'll have our initial files for that. But what I'm going to do here is in the root directory, we're just going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it API. So this is where all my app's API data is going to be stored. So it's inside, it's side by side with our projects app, users, and everything else. So we have a folder here. Now to make this a module, the first thing we need is to create an init file. So $init_.py. And there's going to be 3 main files that I need right now. So the first one is we need all of our URLs. So we need to configure the routes. That's also in the API folder. We are going to need our views. And we're also going to need serializers. So serializers, I always misspell this word. So serializers.py. So we're going to need to serialize data before we return it. So we have these 3. I just want to connect my project to this app here. So the first thing I'm going to do here is create a view. So let's just go ahead and make a quick import here. And this is going to be to return back JSON data. So from Django.http, we are going to import JSON response. So capital J, capital R, that's going to take any Python data that we have and it's going to turn it into JSON data. So it's the right format that we need. Now in here, we just want to create a view, and this is going to be a view that's going to tell us all the URL paths or routes that we're going to have inside of our API. So it's going to be like documentation, I guess, for our API. So when we go to our domain/API, this is the route that's going to be pulled up. And then that way we can see all the available routes in our app here. So we're just going to do return. Then this is going to return back JSON response. So we did HTTP response earlier. Now it's JSON data. And for now, we haven't created the variable yet, but let's just pass in routes. So in here, we're going to create a Python list called routes. And this is just going to have a bunch of dictionaries in here at this point, and these will be turned into JavaScript objects. So what I'm going to do here is specify the method that this specific route takes. So the first one is going to take a get method, and the actual route is going to be API/projects. So this will return back a list of project objects. So that's the first route that we have in our API. I'm going to take this, copy that. So the method and the route. The next one's also going to be get. In this case, we're just going to add in / and it's going to take the ID. So that's also a get method that returns back a single project. Then the next one here is going to be projects / ID. And this is going to take a post method. So when we want to vote on a project, anytime someone clicks on a specific vote, we're sending them to this route, and we're just saying that we want to vote on this project. So we're taking the project ID, and then we're passing in vote right there, and that's going to be a post method. So there's 2 more routes here. The next 2 are going to be to get a token. These are going to be built-in routes that we can actually access that Django gives us. So Django is actually going to give us built-in classes for this, class-based views, kind of like our password reset views, and we are going to be able to generate a token for a user. So this is how we are going to log in users. So we're going to do users / token. So this takes in a post request. In theory, it does actually have a get request, but we're not going to worry about that one. We're just going to send post data to API / users / token. Now I'm going to copy this one. This next route will also take a post request, and this will be for a refresh token. So we'll just do token / refresh. So if you're not familiar with JSON Web Tokens, they do have an expiration date. So when a user's token expires, which is only going to be like 5 minutes, they need to make sure that they can still stay logged in, or they can stay logged in. So we are going to access the refresh token, which is going to generate a new token. We won't get into that until later. So we have our view. We pass that into JSON response. This Python list full of dictionaries will be turned into a JavaScript array full of objects. So JSON response is going to give us JSON data. Okay, so we have our route. Now we want to go into our URL. So remember, we have our folder, API. We do need that init method right there. So make sure that's there. If it doesn't work right away, try just restarting your server. That might be an issue. Sometimes it might not work properly to make it a Python module, but it should be working right now. So let's go into our URLs. From our URLs, we need django.urls import path. So we're just creating a simple URLs file. We'll do URL patterns. And the first path we have here is going to be for our routes here. So we're going to leave that as an empty string. So this is the base URL here. And then we're going into views.getRoutes, which we need to import. So we're just going to do from Django, or from our directory, import views. So this URLs file is inside of our API folder, and so is the views. So we have access to the views. Now we need to go to our root directory and connect this URLs file. So we'll go into dev search. So the project folders will go into URLs, and we need to know, or we need to let this project know about our API. So after here, or after this section, let's go ahead and let's just actually write this out. So we'll create a new path, and we're going to say any route that starts with an API, let's go ahead and include the API folder. So we're going into API / URLs like that. Okay, so now the API's URLs are added. We need to add in a comma. So any route with this is going to send the user here now. So we're going to return back just a get routes file. So let's go ahead and test this right now. We're just going to return back a simple response with JSON data, and then we'll get into the Django REST framework. So right now we have our app. If I go to API, let's see. Okay, so one thing we need to add to our JSON response, we need to add in the save parameter. So the save parameter basically tells us that we can return back something more than just a Python dictionary. So by default, the JSON response can only return back a dictionary. Because we're sending a list, we're going to set save to false. So that's basically saying go ahead and turn any kind of data that we want into JSON data. So we'll go in here. Let's refresh that. And there we go. So this is a JSON response. It's just JSON data. It's not really formatted. The Django REST framework will actually format that for us. But we see this list right here, and then we see all of those objects. So that's it for this video. We just simply return back a simple response. It's not really an API at this point. But in the next video, we will start installing the Django REST framework. We'll get this set up and things are going to start looking a lot nicer. And we're going to have a lot more options with our API because we're going to need to do something called serializing data, which is basically going to take Python objects, so our models, and we're going to need to serialize that. That would be really hard manually, but the Django REST framework already gives us a way to do that. So we're going to see how things get cleaned up here.